Well, welcome everybody to the Tower Center. I'm Josh Rovner, I'm the acting director this year. And I won't say much at all. It's just behooves me to thank you all for coming on this Friday afternoon. We have a terrific speaker and a really important topic and a timely topic now that the TPP has been released. And I assume everybody has read it diligently,
of course,
with care, line by line. So thank you again for coming. Welcome to the Tower Center. And I'm going to hand it over to Hiroki Takeuchi, who's the director of our Sun and Star program on Japan and East Asia.
Thanks. Well, thank you for coming. I'm delighted to introduce my friend, Shihoto Doto. Shihoto is also my colleague of the Mansfield Foundation's U.S.-Japan Network for the Future. Shihoto is a senior Northeast Asia associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Asia program, and she's also contributing editor to the Globalist. Prior to joining the Wilson Center, she spent over 10 years as a journalist, writing about the international political economy with an emphasis on Asian markets. As a correspondent for Dow Jones News Service and United Press International, based in Tokyo and Washington, D.C., she has reported extensively on policies impacting the global financial system as well as international trade. She grew up in Europe, and she has an MA in International Relations from Waseda University in Japan and a BA in Modern History from the University of Oxford. Today she talks about a grand economic strategy for Asia, ? That's important.
Exactly.
And TPP, AIIB, and the challenge ahead for regional partnerships. This is a very good opportunity to follow up our taught the Tower Center Symposium on TPP in September by Dr. Michael Beeman. I was in Japan last week and found that many people were talking about the TPP, and many people were worried about whether U.S. Congress will approve the TPP. And but at the same time, in the international relations, international politics in East Asia, things are moving faster. Last few days, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia expressed interest in joining the TPP. So in Asia, things are seeming to move faster than in the United States, especially the U.S. domestic politics. So this is a very timely topic. Please join me for welcoming Shihoto Doto.
Thank you so much for those words of introduction. It's really a wonderful opportunity for me to be here today. I really want to thank the Tower Center for hosting me. I would be remiss to not point out that the Wilson Center actually has a strong connection to the Tower Center at the moment, as Jim Hollyfield is actually there as a fellow at the moment, and I've had the pleasure of I want to say work, but I haven't actually worked together with him, but I've actually exchanged a lot of views about migration and how it influences the economic landscape, and I'm hoping that in the future I will be able to work with him as well. Before I begin I also wanted to do a brief infomercial about the Woodrow Wilson Center. There are over 200 think tanks in Washington alone. The Wilson Center, according to the University of Pennsylvania's annual ranking of think tanks in the world, is one of the top 10. And we were established in 1968 as an act of Congress. And we are actually the living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, who remains to this day the only American president who has a PhD. Our mission is really to connect the world of thought leadership, including academic research, with public policy, and I think that dovetails very nicely with the efforts that the Tower Center is doing as well. So I'm very happy that we are able to come together here today. Now, on the topic of the grand economic strategy for Asia, the question mark is very important because there are some facts that are undeniable. There is a seismic shift in relations in the Asia Pacific, and not just between the United States and China. it's not as simple as what people like Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group would argue. It's not a G2 system that we're dealing with. It is not fair to compare what's happening today with what the structure was during the Cold War. Asia today is facing the maturity of over 20 years of what's been called the East Asian miracle. And as the region is celebrating greater prosperity, there is a change in the income structure, and there is a change in the relationships that nations have. And the order of hierarchy amongst the nations within Asia is rapidly changing. And with that economic change is a hunger for political as much as economic influence. And as such, the role that history plays, and identity and nationalism, is playing an increasingly important role in defining national interest. And so it's fair to say, I think, to argue that ideology is playing a greater role in establishing a new economic order in Asia. So, as a result, to state that mutual economic interests alone can be a panacea for the ongoing tensions in the region would not be accurate. Now, those who would argue to the contrary would say, well, there is a disconnect between geopolitical tensions and financial markets, and that is true. We turn, for instance, to the situation in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and even at the height of tensions, there is really no correlation between the tensions and the reactions to the financial market. Case in point, last week, the US Navy was challenging China's sovereignty in the South China Sea. But the market reaction to that had been very muted. And if there was a drop in prices in shares in the Southeast Asian bourses, it was largely because they were concerned about the Federal Reserve's moves and not about what was happening in the South China Sea. But if we go beyond the financial markets and we look at investment trends, there is already a convergence of concerns about geopolitical risk and economic reaction, and it's seen in the foreign direct investment landscape. Now, since 1989, China has been the top destination for Japanese FDI. But this year, that trend has changed. China is now in fourth place. Number one is Indonesia, followed by India, and in third place is the United States. So it would be folly to place too much faith in economic interests that could potentially stave off conflict in the region. But let's see it from the other perspective. Can we actually learn? Can we compare the situation that we see today to what had happened on the eve of World War I? At that time, in 1914, Germany, France, and the UK were as closely integrated economically as they had ever been in their histories. And yet, the alliance systems had provoked those countries to set aside those economic interests and go into what became the Great War. What's different today? There are many things that are different today between now and then, but one of the major differences is a redefining of alliances that is not based simply on military concerns, but also on economic issues as well. And so when we say that TPP is the economic component of the US rebalance towards Asia, it really is an integration of the US alliance system that goes beyond simply a military interest, and it really is trying to bring together, converge those interests both economically as well as politically, and bring more countries into the value system of the United States. As President Obama said at the State of the Union in January this year, and I quote, "As we speak, China wants to write the rules for the world's fastest growing region. That would put our workers and our businesses at a disadvantage. Why would we let that happen? We should write those rules. We should level the playing field. But TPP isn't simply about writing rules. It really wants to enhance trade relations based on values and based very much on trust. And if we look, for instance, at the alliance system that the United States has with Japan, we see that the security treaty between the United States and Japan, the Article 2 of that, focuses on the importance of economic partnership to bring stability to the region. The establishment of TPP actually brings the United States and Japan closer together because it does signal an end to the biggest source of friction that the two countries have faced over the past 7 decades. And it is finally establishing a free trade agreement between the largest economy in the world and the third largest economy in the world. Now, let's see what TPP means. I'm sure you've all seen this, but I wanted to kind of make an emphasis on this. There are gains to be made, economic gains to be made by TPP. According to the Institute for International Economics in Washington, the biggest gainer in terms of GDP percentage points would be Vietnam, followed by Malaysia. And at the bottom, amongst the 12th, is the United States with a 0.4 percentage point increase in GDP as a result of joining TPP. But, so maybe to argue that TPP would be a major incentive for the United States to join because of economic reasons would be foolhardy. And certainly the White House has been promoting TPP for geostrategic reasons. And as Defense Secretary Ashton Carter said in April of this year at the University of Arizona, TPP is as important for U.S. security as an aircraft carrier. These values are certainly shared by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Japan, though, has much more of an urgent economic need. Japan, according to the AIIB, will actually gain about 2.2 percentage points in GDP as a result of TPP. Japan, as you may know, has considerable economic challenges, everything from a rapidly aging society where nearly 40% of its population will be over the age of 65 by 2040. Continued doldrums in economic growth, 2 decades of what's called the lost decade. There's a need to stimulate new industries and move away from protectionism of the weaker ones. And Abe says himself, when Japan was actually formally announcing its entry into the TPP, I firmly believe that creating new rules in the Asia-Pacific region with these countries is not only in Japan's national interests, but also certain to bring prosperity to the world. Furthermore, I have no doubt that deepening economic interdependence with these countries in a common economic order will significantly contribute to the security of our country and also to the stability of the Asia-Pacific region. Now, trade can lead to greater trust, and it can lead to closer security ties. Case in point is the bilateral free trade agreement between Australia and Japan that was signed last July. If you go to any Tokyo supermarket today, as a direct result of this, the markets are saturated with Australian beef. It's actually quite difficult to buy American beef these days. There's plenty of Australian macadamia nuts, lobster, asparagus, because they have actually become de facto tariff-free. In Australia, conversely, it's much cheaper to buy Japanese cars and electronics. But it's not just because of these that then Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott, said that Japan is now Australia's closest friend in Asia, unquote. What the free trade agreement between Japan and Australia has done is it's also sped up military ties between the two countries. And as Japan looked since last year to enhance its self-defense capabilities through the collective self-defense mechanism and reinterpreting its pacifist constitution, Australia and Japan now have an agreement on the transfer of defense equipment and technology and to improve military cooperation between the two sides. It's now looking to develop joint submarine technology, and that would certainly be a huge boon to big industrial conglomerates like Hitachi and Mitsubishi. And this is thanks really to the bilateral free trade agreement. Now let's go back to TPP. And there are many questions, as stated before. The details have been released, 31 chapters, nearly 6,000 pages when we add footnotes, actually about 2,000 for the main part. I have to confess, between then, yesterday morning, and today, I have not read all of it. But the questions are, when and how will this conclude? And what impact will this have on the member countries, the 12 member countries? The United States, I'm sure you all know this, but now it has 90 days to actually go over the TPP, and all member countries must ratify TPP. It's not just the United States that's having problems in pushing this through. There's been a change in government in Canada. There's been a change in government in Australia. The AIIB government is still strong, but he is actually looking a little bit weaker than he had been 2 years ago. All these different countries face significant domestic political hurdles in pushing this treaty through. But I think the bigger question is, do the other 11 member countries share the geostrategic values that the United States has in pushing for this trade agreement? And people like Brendan O'Connor of the University of Sydney would argue that US foreign policy ideology has essentially remained unchanged since the days of the Founding Fathers, and that is to say that US foreign policy has three big drivers, namely a deep sense of nationalism or patriotism, a firm belief of American exceptionalism, and a willingness to intervene militarily to push those two pillars through. And those issues, the militarism, sense of exceptionalism, patriotism, are shared on both sides of the political aisle, and regardless of who wins in the next presidential election, that will continue. Obama, as a president, has surprisingly been much more of a realist when it comes to foreign policy, and that could be as a result of what he had inherited from the Bush administration. But at the same time, TPP actually highlights his liberalist approach to diplomacy. And the real achievement of TPP, even to date, is the fact that it's actually bringing together countries of very diverse political aspirations, of very diverging economic backgrounds, and different levels of development. And it's prepared to accommodate those differences by leveling the playing field according to their different developmental stages and bringing them all into the same fold. So you have, on the one hand, countries like the United States and Canada and Australia, but you're also seeing new entrants like communist Vietnam. And these 12 countries are united in the need to pursue common standards, everything ranging from intellectual property protection to ensuring common environment and labor standards. And to be part of that, countries like Japan have been willing or have been forced to essentially put aside some of its initial demands. Japan has had 5 agricultural sectors that it has seen as sacred, and those are beef, rice, pork, dairy, sugar. And rice has been particularly controversial, but this is the first time that Japan is actually prepared to relinquish those 5 sacred sectors because of this need for the overall broader security as well as economic need to push through a TPP. TPP essentially for Japan means that it can get its economy back on track by leveraging that external pressure to push through reform in agriculture, in healthcare, the financial sector, bring efficiencies to those weak industries, and essentially push through structural reform. And other countries are wanting to do that too. And so I think even as we talk about when and how TPP will conclude, it's still not too early to begin discussing the possibilities of new entrants and the possible conflicts that could actually bring about. So right now, let's see Japan. Japan is the only major power that is in all of the significant multilateral trade deals in the Asia-Pacific region. Korea, which actually does have a free trade agreement with the United States, is a possible entrant into the TPP. And China, since Japan expressed its will to join TPP 2 years ago, has no longer sees TPP as an instrument to contain China, but Beijing is very interested in learning more about becoming part of the TPP. And let's look at, I think it's going to be very difficult for you to see in the back, but let me just highlight some of the trade gains that can be seen from the TPP. This is actually done by Peter Petrie at Brandeis University. But if you think the example of Japan will gain about 2% as a member of TPP. If that is actually expanded to include 4 other countries, namely Indonesia, Philippines, Korea, and I'm listing one, I can't remember which one the last one is. If there are 4 new entrants, then it actually increases to 2.4%. What's interesting, if you look at this chart though, is China. China actually, by TPP actually moving forward with the 12 member countries, its GDP will actually take a hit. It will go down by 0.2% because it is excluded from this trade agreement that represents 40% of the global economy. If it's expanded to 16 countries, it's actually going to go down by 0.5%. For the United States, the increase is only going to be nominal from 0.4 to 0.5%. So, and for Korea, by not being part of TPP, its economy will go down by 0.1 percentage points. But if it does join, it increases by 2.4%. So the incentive for Korea to join is pretty high. And for those who are looking at Japan-Korea relations or Korean relations vis-a-vis the politics of East Asia, it's very tempting to say that TPP can actually be that instrument that will bring the Japanese and the Chinese closer together, and that this will be the final way forward for the 2 countries to go beyond their historical differences and go beyond their political conflict and work together for a common goal. Unfortunately, though, I think this is too simplistic a view. I believe that it would actually create more tensions that, at least in the short term, than it would actually provide an incentive for closer cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo. Jeff Schott at the Peterson Institute has pointed out that when Korea and the United States signed their bilateral free trade agreement, the Chorus Agreement, which is seen as the gold standard for bilateral free trade agreements, what happened was that even though it is a so-called gold standard in trade, rice for Korea was an exemption. Now, if Korea does decide to join TPP, no holds barred. Rice will have to be on the table, and the Japanese will certainly insist that Korea concede as much as it had in order to become a member. Now, this could be played out in a number of ways, and none of them are going to be good. It will lead to a lot of media coverage, which will invariably be negative, and it could add fuel to the flames of hostility between the two countries. Another sore point could be Taiwan. Taiwan very much wants to be part of TPP, but Taipei is also very concerned that what happened when it ascended to the WTO will happen as it tries to join TPP as well. What happened with WTO was China, because of the One China policy, China had to wait until Taiwan had to wait until China was ready to join WTO as well in 2001. Now, the talk about things coming on a timely basis. President Ma of Taiwan and Xi Jinping will be meeting tomorrow, I believe, in Singapore. And there's been a lot, and this is a historic meeting. And there's a lot of speculation and rumor about, is this a KMT ploy? Is this President Ma's last hurrah? What is he trying to do? How will it play out? But from a TPP perspective, the question really becomes, does this make it more difficult or easier for Taiwan to go solo and join TPP even without China? Will it be easier for the 11 other countries to accept that the PRC and ROC can be two separate entrants into this trade framework? Another political issue when it comes to potential new entrants is the potential divide between Indonesia, Thailand, Korea, and the Philippines. These are the four countries that are most likely to be the next entrants to the TPP. Korea has already said that a collective bargaining process among these four countries is not possible. And if that's the case, will this have a divisive influence on the security policy that the United States has vis-a-vis Korea, vis-a-vis the Philippines? Will it actually lead to more friction between the United States and what it should be its core allies rather than not? So as we talk about the pros and cons of expanding TPP, the challenges ahead, not just in ratifying it, but expanding it, we should also bear in mind, as I said in the slide before, the alternative trade regimes that exist. RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, it was actually launched by the Japanese, but it's been embraced as a Chinese initiative now. It includes the major East Asian powers, China, Korea, and Japan. And it has been criticized as a trade mechanism that is really focused much more on reducing trade barriers, tariff barriers, rather than actually addressing issues of the 21st century, like environmental issues or labor standards. But I should point out that if our aim is to broaden the tent and widen the tent and bring more countries into the value system of free markets, then this is actually bringing together countries that really have been outside of that tent for the longest time. Countries like Cambodia and Laos and Myanmar. And so the achievement of RCEP is not insignificant. That said, this is not going to address major issues like state-owned enterprises, which have been a major stumbling block in leveling the playing field. And as Stefan Halper of Cambridge University says, RCEP could actually be seen as a mechanism to ensure market authoritarianism. It's not really about these countries trying to assimilate to for lack of a better word, a Western trade system, but it's actually a way for China to push forward its alternative economic system and making it appeal to a wider, diverse group. Now, the politics of trade is obvious not just on the multilateral side, but also on the bilateral side. And I would be remiss to not mention that China earlier this year signed a bilateral free trade agreement with Korea. And the economic significance of that may be fairly limited, and it is actually, it does not touch on any of the sensitive issues, and it really focuses much more on wording rather than actual economic gain. The political impact that this bilateral free trade agreement has had is considerable, and it can be argued that it has deepened China's relations with Korea. And we can see, for instance, last month, Korean President Park Geun-hye was the only leader from a U.S. ally's perspective that actually was part of the victory parade in Beijing, being very sensitive to those economic ties. Now, the U.S. obviously too has strong connections to China, and it is also pursuing a bilateral treaty of its own with China as well. It doesn't get as much play because of all this talk about TPP, but there is the bilateral investment treaty, the BIT, between the United States and China, and this is really to give greater transparency in operations between China and the United States. It's going to have a tremendous uphill task going through approval on the Hill. But we need to remember that trade agreements on a multilateral basis are not simply about boosting economic ties, but it really is to boost strategic ties both on the political front as much as an economic front, or to keep out or work against those who are not part of that framework. And when we talk about multilateral institutions, it's important to remember that there is a new regional economic order that's being created that goes beyond trade, and that is very much highlighted with the creation of the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Cynics are quick to dismiss the AIIB. They argue that it is a mechanism for China to pursue its broader One Belt, One Road strategy, and that it is a way for China to ease some of its excess capacity. The critics are also quick to point out that China, because of its altruistic motives, will not be as diligent in looking at the environmental impact of large projects, and that it will not be aware of the social consequences of such big infrastructure development projects. And that to focus too much on infrastructure development, which has actually gone out of vogue amongst the Bretton Woods institutions since the late 70s, early 80s, it's actually not a new mechanism, but it's actually going back to what the MDBs used to do, and it's actually not something that is really the way for the future for emerging markets. They're also eager to point out that the AIIB will have a non-resident board, and it will not have the ability to have a check and balance on the projects that are going to be approved by the AIIB. Now, these arguments, I think, are premature. It is clear that this is on issues like environmental protection and labor standards. China does see these issues very seriously. It's actually trying to recruit aggressively current and former World Bank and Asian Development Bank staff. It's actually recruiting people who are not necessarily from the member countries. It is open, for instance, to Americans. as well. And it is actually offering quite a lot more money to these economists and engineers than they are getting at the World Bank and the AIIB at the moment. We actually don't know what the AIIB projects will be, and we won't know what they will be until at least the first quarter of next year. And several projects will be up for vote for the board. But what is clear is that it has been successful in garnering the support of 57 countries. And what is also clear is that the US knee-jerk reaction against the launch of the AIIB has been seen as a diplomatic disaster for the United States. Whether it could have, the decision for the United States not to join AIIB is one thing. The response, how it reached that conclusion, how it publicized that decision not to join, could have been handled much differently, and the White House is actually trying to backtrack a lot on what it has been saying, and with great difficulty. That kind of knee-jerk reaction by the White House actually has reminded me a lot about the experience that happened 20 years ago with the creation or the launch, the balloon launch at the Asian Monetary Fund. This came in 1997 during the meltdown of the Asian countries during a financial crisis where the economies of Indonesia, Thailand, and Korea were falling, and they were at the mercy of the IMF. And what was found was that, given that often their currencies, their exchange rate systems were fixed to the dollar, it was very difficult for them to actually get out of this crisis situation, and it was very difficult for them to negotiate with the IMF as well. The AMF, the Asian Monetary Fund proposal by the Japanese government was seen as a counterbalance to this, to meet some of the gaps that were left by the IMF. But it actually went nowhere, largely in part because of stringent U.S. opposition to something that might threaten the existing institutions of the Bretton Woods groups. It did eventually lead to the creation of the Chiang Mai Initiative, which currently has a reserve pool of about $240 billion to address the short-term liquidity problems that the region faces. But what's interesting about the Chiang Mai Initiative is it's never been called upon to date. And there are a number of reasons. The amount of money that's available is small, but also the fact that it's dependent on the kicking in has to come only with the loans from the IMF. So the countries that would request Chiang Mai support would actually have to already have support from the IMF, in which case they could probably get that financial support from the IMF, and it doesn't really need to resort to the Chiang Mai Initiative. So the intrigue, going back to the AIIB, the intrigue about the AIIB continues. I was actually at the Brookings Institution last month when Jin Li-Kwan, the AIIB head, was there to give a big presentation. It was not just standing room only. There was an overflow room that was standing room only. This is how popular this initiative, what anything that Mr. Jin had to say was greatly anticipated by those analysts in Washington. And when he was asked whether he was in Washington to try to get the United States to join the AIIB, he responded that, oh no, America has not invited China to join the TPP, but we, China, we are very open-minded and we have a big heart, and we would always welcome the United States to join the AIIB. And if the United States wanted to join, it would do so. AIIB would allow the United States to do so in a heartbeat. AIIB has really been a diplomatic coup for China, I think at the cost of the United States. And Chinese diplomacy at the moment is really about political gain. And it's not just about getting a step ahead in economic growth. What it really wants is influence, and it really wants to win in its move towards creating alliances. And I think the AIIB has been the first concrete move in that direction. So, one of the questions we all have, of course, about TPP and expanding TPP is, will we be able to bring China into the fold of free market economics? And I think Hiroki would actually be the better person to answer about Beijing's aspirations. But what I can say is that we should not assume that the open architecture of TPP, the willingness of the Trans-Pacific Partnership to accept new members in itself will be an incentive for Beijing to pursue market reform. And we should not either assume that the AIIB is simply a specialized multilateral development bank focused on infrastructure development. It is a political tool, and it is a move for China to build consensus and to build political support. And we should not assume that economic integration itself is a panacea to tensions in the region, because, as I said at the beginning, the tensions come not from economic competition, but from an increase in nationalism. So what is safer to assume is that China has its own vision of an alternative economic and political landscape to that which currently exists. And in order to counterbalance that vision, there are a number of steps, concrete steps that need to be taken. One, certainly, is the Asian Development Bank's own lending process should be increased. At the moment, there is an infrastructure development gap, a funding gap of about $8 trillion. ADB only provides about 13 billion of that at the moment, so there's a huge gap. Japan, as the biggest shareholder of the ADB, Japan has already proposed to increase its support over the next 5 years by 30% to the tune of $110 billion, but that's still not going to meet that financing gap. There's also a desperate need for the Bretton Woods institutions themselves to be reformed so that it better reflects the voices of emerging markets, not just China, but the other BRICS as well as the G20 as well. And there is an urgent need for the United States to conclude the TPP and follow through on its commitments to the international community. It also has an obligation to meet its funding requirements to the IMF. It needs to show that it actually can and will be a leader in providing economic leadership in the region. And right now, that is not actually as clear as it could be. So with that, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So Thomas, you have a class, so.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation. I had one question. So you mentioned the economic virtues of the TPP, and also the fact that the US, for example, was expecting more from it in strategic terms. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about the mechanisms by which an economic convergence is going to translate into strategic advantages for the United States. You mentioned the words values, alliances. So the mechanisms through which we turn something which is economic in nature into something more strategic.
So what is the relationship between economic alliances and military alliances, right? So I gave the example of the Australian one where it's based on trust. And what has happened is that we are finding, the example of Vietnam is very good. Vietnam is probably on a security front closer to China than it is to the United States in many respects. But by bringing Vietnam into the fold of TPP, it is actually being an incentive to work more closely together with the United States. This is an opportunity to work more closely with the United States on issues that it has been ignoring in the past. It actually provides, one of the challenges that Vietnam will face will be to provide higher labor standards in the textile sector. The United States will be able to provide a lot of, not as the government necessarily, but the private sector and non-governmental organizations will be able to provide a lot of the technical assistance and the support that it will need. It will lead to closer cooperation, and that actually is a foundation for building the trust that is needed today, and that should be seen as an investment towards Vietnam actually being part of the United States at the cost of keeping China at bay.
Yeah, regarding the Vietnam, like a few weeks ago, Tower Center had a delegation from the Southeast Asian countries, and then I asked the Vietnamese journalist why did Vietnam participated in the TPP, and then she said, in 2012 when China was very aggressive in South China Sea. Originally, there was a division between pro-U.S. versus pro-China in the Vietnamese leadership, and then they were united for pro-U.S. And then they decided to join. So the TPP actually has a kind of function of empowering the pro-U.S. group in the Vietnamese domestic politics.
And I think that's true in other countries as well. And I think someone like you would argue that TPP is actually a way for China to be part of that group as well, and because there is a divide within China of those who are the international market oriented and those who are much more about let's push the One Belt One Road initiative, right? So by encouraging China to join TPP, it actually is a way to bring forward the more internationalist Chinese.
Right. Okay? So the TPP would empower the reformists in China, and then so reformists in the same in terms of the reformists for domestic economic reform, and then reformists are also internationalists for foreign policy. So a TPP would empower the internationalists in Chinese leadership. Josh.
So terrific talk. I love a good old-fashioned realist analysis. Underlying drivers of conflict are political, and don't put all your eggs in the economic basket. It's not going to solve your problems. But I want to push you on what would happen if TPP actually fell apart. What would happen if it didn't go through Congress? At the end of the talk, you suggested that would be very bad. Right, that the United States really needs this because it's a way of consolidating its alliances, and really strengthening its position, keeping these countries tightly together, and presenting new opportunities even for military cooperation. Right? So economics used instrumentally. What happens if it doesn't happen? Well, the realist in me says not a lot, because two things are going on. If economics aren't the underlying driver of hostility or alliances, then the U.S. and its allies will still find ways to get along militarily and diplomatically, even if economically they're at loggerheads. And at the same time, it's not like the United States hasn't been doing other stuff to bolster its position in Asia. It's increasing its presence, it's reinforcing its rhetorical commitment to Japan, Philippines, other places. So I'm trying to be an optimist. So if it fails, maybe it won't fail so badly. Why would this it constitute such a grand strategic problem if TPP went away?
The economic consequences would be not that big, especially for the United States.
Right.
As we see, there,
Yeah.
it's not that big.
Right.
However, in the international community at large, it would be yet another example of the United States saying, "Do as I tell you, not as I do." That it can come up with initiatives, but it backtracks. This is seen in things like the environmental treaties that the United States has agreed upon but has not ratified. It's seen in the IMF where it's committed and yet not paid up. It would be yet another example of the United States not following through on its international commitments. And why is that bad? That is bad because until now there has been no other outlet for countries to actually have an alternative vision, to be part of something else. And when it comes to trade, there are credible alternatives here. And I talk about RCEP, the United States is not part of this. What happens is that the integration of these countries will actually continue to increase, and the possibilities of the United States being able to attract the newly emerging markets will actually continue to decrease. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to military alliances as well, it does start to actually it starts to eat away at the confidence measures. Not all countries, the US-Japan alliance is very strong. And so it's 70 years of continued alliance. It's the strongest since, people like to say, since the Treaty of Westphalia. And there is TPP or no TPP, it will remain strong, right? But that's not necessarily the case with the other countries at risk. And what's happening in Asia is that we are seeing the less engagement of the United States in the region. The U.S. rebalance to Asia is seen very much as a myth, that it's not seen as something that is real. Yes, when we see it from a military perspective, you're saying that, 30%, 40% of the military forces will be in the Asia-Pacific theater within the next 15 years or so. That may well be, but in terms of real engagement and commitment by the United States, in terms of providing infrastructure support, and in terms of providing things that will actually be visible to countries and help them actually elevate their presence, that's going to be less and less likely if the United States is not part of the TPP. So I think that's where we have to really look at this treaty. It is a, can the United States be a reliable partner or not?
It's a credibility test.
It's a credibility test.
Mm-hmm. And that's also, I would be as optimistic as your optimistic scenario if China can make a rule. But it seems that China is even more struggling with making rule in East Asia. RCEP here is really stagnating. Then if US cannot can ratify the TPP, and then there is no international economic agreement in Asia Pacific, then China, unlike what Obama says, Obama says, if we do not make a rule, China will make a rule. I would say if China makes a rule, it would be a better scenario than nobody makes a rule. So, and then I'm afraid that what would happen is nobody can make a rule. So I'm worried about kind of the rule, kind of Asia Pacific without economic rules. So, yeah.
I was going to say, it's also pretty clear that China is emerging and really wants to take a leadership position in Asia. I think that's pretty clear. And if TPP falls, that would almost elevate, as far as the U.S. is concerned, if TPP doesn't go through, that would almost elevate further China's position or influence in Asia. But I have my opinion. Maybe I should put it in a question. But as China is emerging, are they also trying to influence the region more on a financial side, monetary side with the Chinese yuan? What do you see happening there?
Well, the yuan is going to be one of the SDRs of the IMF, and that's been very much lauded in the Chinese media. The real significance of that is more symbolic. So it becomes one of the basket currencies that the IMF has. Right now it's the euro, the dollar, the yen, and so when you have the yuan, it elevates, but it's not going to lead to a rush to buy Chinese yuan at the moment, but it does elevate the Chinese currency.
Well, I'm just thinking if the TPP doesn't get ratified in the U.S., would that have a further impact on the financial side with China?
Will China have the edge over the United States because of the TPP not being signed?
Yes.
Yes, because there is going to be this power vacuum, and whether or not RCEP or the other FTAP, which is even a bigger trade mechanism than RCEP, or whether the CJK, the China, Japan, Korea trilateral agreement, actually makes any headway or not. There are alternatives that are being proposed, and this is it. The United States has no other cards to give out, and so it can pursue bilateral trade agreements afterwards. But if we have anything to learn from the Chorus agreement between the United States and Korea, it takes a lot of energy to do these things. It's been 5 years of negotiating TPP. There's trade exhaustion. And this is the one opportunity that the United States has. Japan has other cards. China has other cards. This is it for the United States. And so will it be seen as a sign of retreat of the United States from the Asian Pacific theater? Will it be seen as something that the rebalance actually is a myth, at least on a comprehensive front? I think that would actually give ammunition to that kind of thinking, and it would certainly boost the confidence of the Chinese authorities.
Nicholas, and then Sam.
Thank you for your talk. That was really interesting. Mine is sort of a follow-up question to this optimism, pessimism side. So part of your argument was that economic integration will not lead to better historical relations, or to a place where these historical tensions between China, South Korea, and Japan could be resolved in some way, and actually getting Korea into this system might actually make it worse. And I'm wondering if in your analysis there's room somewhere for it actually to improve. Is there a way that relationships between South Korea and Japan and China in this kind of system might get better?
I want to kind of re-emphasize what I wanted to say. It's to say that to see economic integration as the one key road to peace is not the case. That there is divergence, and that it won't necessarily be the answer. So when the trilateral meeting between Japan, Korea, and South Korea and China happened last weekend, in advance there was a lot of hope that there will be greater trade relations. It's not. The schism between Japan and Korea and between Japan and China is so deep that in itself it's not going to be enough for them to lead to a meaningful breakthrough in the tensions of history, or the whole idea of interpreting the past. And I think what we really need to come back to is this whole idea of, the landscape of Asia has changed, and economic growth, the economic hierarchy, even 10 years ago was pretty clear that Japan was number one, and then number two was China, and then there were other countries. And that hierarchy was very, very clear, and it was reflected not just in asset prices, but in actual investment trends as well. and China was very dependent on Japanese trade. Korea had been dependent on Japanese trade as well. That is changing, and the mindset of the Japanese, I don't think, has changed in relation to the reality of what it is, the economic reality of the region at the moment. So what is really wanted from the Korean government vis-a-vis Japan is an apology, for lack of a better word, when the two sides are on equal footing. And so the Japanese could say, Japan has apologized for a number of ways, and has provided reparations for the losses of World War II, but it's never done so on an equal footing. And so now it wants to have that apology, to have that recognition as an equal partner in the economic hierarchy. And that's not happening anytime soon. It's very difficult, and I think if there are ways to... The last trilateral meeting, the fact that it happened was a step in the right direction. The fact that they've agreed to meet again is a positive step in the right direction. But at the same time, the whole hope that economic cooperation will lead to some concrete steps for working together, that's not going to happen. I think that's been made very, very clear, because there is an understanding that what Japan provides is no longer what has been necessary in the past.
Sandy.
I'm going to ask you something way back in history, way back probably for most people in here, because on November 4th, 1940, there was a meeting between Generalissimo Franco and Hitler, and of course during the Civil War there, and there was the origin of the term on the defense of the Battle of Madrid that was called Fifth Column.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering if you had done any research there, and if so, was there any similarity or identicality on some of the activities that are actual now or potential that's going on there in the Far East?
I'm going to have to skip on
I'm
that
sorry.
one. I'm going to have to bail on that one. Sorry. No. No.
I didn't hear you. What?
No.
You-
I am not
Okay.
capable of
Then let
answering
me
your
suggest
question.
that you might want to look into that.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I had a twin brother who's dead now, wrote a book
Uh-huh.
on Hendalia, and that's why I'm somewhat literate on just what I told you.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sandy.
I'm going to ask a question that you might well ask also, and that is whether this trade agreement incorporates any aspects of intellectual property in it. There have been past agreements like the Uruguay Round agreements where there was an effort made at copyright harmonization, for instance, and I just wonder if in all these 6,000 pages
8,000.
IP is addressed IP is addressed at all.
Yes. There's a whole chapter
Yeah.
Okay.
of it.
And in what terms? What is the aim of it?
This is the first endeavor that not only to have some kind of multilateral approach to have some kind of IP protection, but not just protection, enforcement and arbitration and dispute settlement. And I think it's been difficult because until now there hasn't really been an ability to impose any kind of copyright infringement, because it's usually been following the domestic rules of that particular country. So copyright infringement in China, or IP issues in China, Vietnam, or drug issues in Malaysia. These have been domestically regulated, and it hasn't been imposed by an international law. And even if there were infringements, it's been very difficult from a government-to-government perspective to be able to to voice those concerns, and this actually provides the mechanism to do so. Now, what I do need to look into is how these are actually going to be enforced, and how they're actually going to be the dispute settlement for this, because it is easy to argue that there have been IP infringement, but the challenge has always been, well, what do you do about it? I think that will be where there will be money to be made by not just the law firms, but also the private companies as well.
Are all these countries members of WIPO?
Yes. Yes.
So that mechanism already unites them?
Yes.
Gosh.
Just to follow up on that, because one of the things, I may be more on the economics than the realist side of the analysis. That doesn't matter. I think they're intertwined. It's hard to separate the two. So I was wondering if you could comment on some of the industries that are sort of behind, at least from the U.S. side. I mean, there's so much secrecy over TPP, right? So there's so many conspiracies that have come up.
You mean like the drug companies? I think those are the biggest ones.
I know we haven't looked at the document itself, but yeah, certainly the pharmaceutical companies, as far as patenting, the whole issue about trying to put more barriers for generic drug entry.
Right, and I think.
But are there other industries? Pharma is the one that gets a lot of attention on the global, especially in this region. But, and then trade. I mean, you mentioned the enforcement issue, some of the trademark issues for luxury goods and things like that.
Right. Going back to the pharmaceutical issue, I do think the revolutionary approach that the WTO, the TPP has been able to do is to have that two-tier approach, and so that it does have two standards, one for the emerging markets like Vietnam, and those for the United States, and that has, of course, been a point of great discomfort for big pharma, but it's also come under attack from both ends, from the manufacturing side and from the user side, from groups like Médecins Sans Frontières onwards. The other companies like Google and Apple and Microsoft have been very much for TPP. And it's when we talk about the TPP as the agreement for the 21st century, it's because that it may lead to losses for the traditional conventional industries like agriculture and manufacturing in general. It does provide the protection, or at least some of the protection, that the service sector has. And I think things like the financial sector, there will be protection of new instruments and new ways of new products on the financial markets that emerge that will actually come under some kind of protection as well. And that really has not been something that has been moving forward, and it would be of great benefit to the investment banks.
Yeah, I'm thinking of agriculture too as another industry.
Right.
I mean, the financial stuff, I don't know about the business method patents and things, so there may be more protection. I just don't. But that's another issue. It's interesting to look at agriculture when you talk about rice.
Yeah.
Because when you have the WTO and WIPO,
Yeah.
a lot of issues about geographic protection for foods and
Right.
and I don't know if there's the same sort of thing within TPP. Whether there's a Japanese rice versus.
Yeah, well,
Chinese
what
rice
they've
or
done with the
I think
rice.
it's more about the commodity rather than the symbolism. I don't know.
Yeah, the thing about like rice is, in the case of Japan, it's actually going to have an import quota, so it has to actually import about 50,000 tons.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, then and that is going to be raised to 70,000 tons, and Japan has to buy those products from the United States, not necessarily the United States, but from other TPP member countries as well. So, and in terms of other products too, it's the import quota actually does kick in for sugar as well. The others are more about tariff reduction, and it's a rapid reduction from about 40% for pork to and it rapidly drops to about 8%. Yeah, it's huge. And I talked about the macadamia nuts of Australia. I mean, that went from like 25 or 28% to 0. but macadamia nuts, I love macadamia nuts, but I don't need to eat macadamia nuts. However, when it comes to things like pork or milk products, powdered milk products, these are essential products that will actually really impact the commodities market. It's funny though, I read, and who told me this as well? I read it and someone confirmed it. Rice price will actually go up as a result of market liberalization because there will be more competition and there will be more.
It's no longer the cheapest country. Or
Yeah.
anyway, it's just
Yeah. So everyone can just flood the market, and so right now it might be a limited amount of California rice going into the Japanese markets or whatever, but now it'll be a flood of Australia, New Zealand, what have you, and you also have to bear in mind Australia has benefited greatly from this bilateral trade agreement with Japan and on the beef sector. If you do go to Japan, I mean, the Australian beef has its own logo, right? They market it as something that's aspirational, but when TPP is ratified, concluded, and is put into place, and that is contingent on all 12 countries saying yes, and then they have 60 days to actually start enforcing it. The United States competition is not going to be with Japanese tariffs. It's going to be Australia. It's going to be New Zealand. It's going to be Canada. So to assume that market liberalization, this is great. Liberalization means competition. And competition means prices could go down, but it could also go up. So there is no monopoly. The end of monopolies is coming. And the results may actually not be in your favor. And I don't think a lot of the cattle producers in the United States or the pork farmers or the dairy farmers of Canada or New Zealand actually recognize that it's not necessarily going to work to their advantage.
Related stuff in farm subsidies, is it going to
I'm so sorry, I cannot hear.
Farm subsidies,
Yes,
is it going to be affected by TPP?
yes.
So you will cut off.
It will be tapered off in a over a 5-year period. But you have to remember, for countries like Japan, the average age of a farmer is about 65, 66. It only represents 2% of the population. 2% of the population, and so it's not. 65 is often retirement age for a lot of people.
US farmers.
US
I'm
farmers.
talking about the United States.
Oh, U.S. farmers. Well, U.S. farmers are going to benefit from this.
But they get
subsidies.
subsidies.
They get subsidies too. They will have to. They are actually going to have to.
How many years do you have?
They get. U.S. farmers actually are. I haven't actually checked in the latest, the 8,000-page document, but the understanding was that they have a grace period of going up to about 10 to 15 years. But that's a lot. The most generous grace periods are going to be in the car industry, which is about 25 years. But yeah, so you see the hierarchy of how big your extension is going to be in these things. But it's.
Lynn.
First of all, I want to make sure that we recognize our good friend John Stick here. He's the honorary consul for Japan.
Oh, great.
Here in Dallas. So, sorry, I just wanted to make sure that you knew that.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you.
The question I have is the elephant in the room. We don't have the votes for it yet. And I was totally shocked to find out that Hillary rejected it. So does that mean gathering momentum against the agreement, or will we be able to pull it through?
I was talking over lunch today that part of my job at a think tank is to brief aides of elected members on the Hill. And their biggest question right now is, help me help you. I'm seen as pro-TPP, but help me help you because my member has people lined up who are concerned about their jobs, and he has to be able to justify why he's supporting TPP against the opposition of his constituents. And it is particularly difficult given the bipartisan nature of it. As you pointed out, Hillary has come out against it, even though she was actually in the State Department and was essentially an architect for TPP, and she's voting, she's not repudiating it. Those who are the swayables that I am talking to right now are the Republicans in the middle. They're not actually from the heartland. They're actually in other geographies across the United States. And it's trying to identify those Republicans who are willing to vote yes, but are finding it difficult amid opposition from their voters. And there are enough of them, but we don't have a lot of time. It's a very difficult sell. To sell the security argument, all of this that we talk about the how do you say it? The national security angle of it.
Wasn't it General Dempsey who said this is one of the most important national security issues that we have?
But I was speaking to Mitch McConnell's aide. I'm probably not supposed to say this, but Mitch McConnell's aide, and they're like, he's never going to vote yes, ever, no way. So you find that it is actually not as partisan. It's one of the very few issues that is not partisan. If anything, the partisanship comes from within the Democratic Party. None of the Democratic candidates have come as pro-TPP. Neither Bernie nor Hillary are supportive of it, and the other candidates are not really viable, right? So, and when you turn to the Republican side, it's a difficult sell. It is a very difficult sell, but it is something that the White House is incredibly committed to. And when we talk about lobbying efforts by the administration, it is they're going to have to back channel it and try to, because the TPP itself, it's an up or down vote. Now that TPA has passed,
Right,
you can't have
exactly.
any amendments, you cannot do anything. But
Exactly.
there are ways for the administration to negotiate and to kind of add some kind of direct or indirect incentive to vote yes. But it's not easy, and the votes are against TPP right now. And it's not just the United States.
Not just the United States.
No, it's
There
not
are
just the
votes
United
in
States.
other countries too.
New Zealand is going to be New Zealand is a huge problem.
One country like New Zealand, or maybe Canada,
Yeah.
the new prime minister.
Yeah.
What's going to happen? Because they're just going to do those rest of the country who's going to ratify the countries
Right.
join it, and they're just going to drop, and that's all.
Right.
You mentioned that there's a trend worldwide towards elimination of monopolies, and that the TPP will probably contribute somewhat to that. One of the groups that I think was very negative on the TPP has had some things on the internet about making a point of, I guess it's in the preamble where it talks about there is a role for state-owned enterprises, and they were introducing it in a negative fashion.
Right.
But I wonder to what degree this was put in there primarily to benefit Vietnam and Singapore a few of the others that do have state-owned enterprises, or whether it had a longer-term view looking at China or others, and if so, what it has to do with pluses or minuses about the role of state-owned enterprises.
Yeah, I mean, state-owned enterprises or government-led enterprise initiatives has been a huge stumbling block for the United States, which really doesn't have that kind of policy at all. The TPP actually is looking to level that playing field, but there are already exceptions. The exceptions come from Singapore, as well as Malaysia and Vietnam, and especially on the front of sovereign wealth funds. When it comes to actual companies, though, this should make it easier for the United States to compete head-on with big conglomerates, for instance, like steel makers or textile companies that have had protection. They will be treated as private companies under this new treaty. So it is to the advantage of the United States. But having said that, the big downfall, I mean, talking about who's against TPP and in which district, Vietnam, SOE, textile companies will take a hit, but at the same time they'll still continue to produce, and their exports are going to flood the United States, and that will kill the textile industry in North Carolina, South Carolina, and the coastal areas of the United States where it's happening. So it's the state directive mechanism will actually take a hit, but it won't be enough.
It is more for the existing members of the TPP than it is to look forward to China, in your view, then.
Yes, China, I think one of the biggest stumbling blocks for China to join TPP will be precisely this, the state-owned enterprise issue, because that's essentially all of China's major industrial base, and to change the business practices on that side will be very difficult. But let me leave it at that.
Actually, related to that point, my question is, in that sense, like how much does nationalism matter? I mean, you thought about nationalism because state-owned enterprises is state-owned enterprises is basically institutionalized form of vested interests, and so it seems that the vested interest is the major obstacle, and they are together with the nationalism or nationalists.
Yeah.
So you started talking about that nationalism is rising and increasing nationalism, especially in the Asia side. Is it that really increasing nationalism or increasing resistance from the vested interests?
Increasing nationalism in terms of new systems coming up. So instead of China trying to figure out ways to join TPP to come up with alternative visions, that's where nationalism plays up. But in terms of vested interests, the United States, at the height of the U.S.-Japan trade wars, because there really was a war, Japan does not have state-owned. Well, it does have state-owned enterprises, but a lot of the attacks by the United States on Japanese corporations was that precisely that there is vested interest that the government has in supporting specific companies. We're living in a multinational world, and the successful companies are becoming more borderless, and it's in their interest to go beyond that. And we're seeing one of the other things that is becoming a huge issue, was a huge issue in TPP, has been the rule of origin. And so companies like Toyota or Ford or Microsoft Microsoft doesn't make stuff, HP. They're assembling parts from all over the place, and then to label it, how are we going to label it, right? The companies themselves transcend nations, and so this is a reflection of corporate interest. It goes beyond national interest. But the structure itself, who calls those rules, that's where the nationalism kicks in. And to say that I own this rule-making mechanism, I'm calling the shots. I have 35% of the shareholding in AIIB. I have 8%. I have 16% in IMF. I am the head of the AIIB. I am American, therefore I am the head of the IMF. Those are where the national interests come in, national pride. And you can't get enough of those leadership positions.
Okay, now TPP is concluded internationally, but this is actually beginning of the second round of the rule making. So, please join me for thanking Shihoto Doto.